We're staying with the story with the ICC. Now, the push for South Africa to withdraw from the International Criminal Court came after the arrival of Sudanese President al-Bashir here in South Africa. In June 2015, President Omar al-Bashir arrived in South Africa, triggering South Africa's domestic and international law duty to arrest him for subsequent transfer to The Hague. Now, President Bashir was wanted for war crimes, genocide and crimes against humanity, and 2 international warrants of arrest were issued in 2009 and 2010, respectively. Despite existing arrest warrants, President Bashir was not arrested. The Southern North Gauteng High Court on an urgent basis seeking the implementation of the arrest warrants. Now, does the latest signal the end of the legal case against South Africa? Well, the SALC lawyer for International Criminal Justice Program, Angela Mdukuti, joins us here in studio to give us their perspective on the case in South Africa. Intends to challenge South Africa's withdrawal from the ICC.
We intend to challenge this withdrawal because it's been conducted in the nation sector. And effectively sidestepping because this is a decision that needs all the stakeholders to take part in, and the executive has shown no regard for that.
It needs public participation as well.
Yes, to repeal an act through Parliament. Is allowed to participate, and relevant stakeholders can make submissions as the bill goes through Parliament. What
would you say if government would tell you that this is only the beginning stage? It's an information letter to the ICC to give their intent to withdraw.
Well, that's factually inaccurate, because once you write to the United Nations Secretary General, that's when the countdown for withdrawal begins. And do that without having repealed the Implementation Act, because we're bound in terms of that law. And so government should have gone through Parliament first. And then once that process was successful, if it was successful, then you can write to the Secretary General indicating your intention to withdraw. Because now what they're effectively doing is preempting the result in Parliament, which I don't think bodes well for a constitutional democracy that's founded on transparency.
The trigger has been pulled. What now for South Africa? What are some of the consequences that the country might face, you think?
So now South Africa has not only tarnished its reputation internationally, but domestically as well. It is the citizens of this country who will suffer, because if South Africa leaves the ICC, repeals the Implementation Act, that is the seminal piece of legislation that governs the prosecution and investigation of crimes against humanity, genocide and war crimes. Without that, the legislative framework has a serious gap in it. And should there be a genocide or war crimes or crimes against humanity committed in this country, there will be no legislative framework to deal with it, and there'll be no International Criminal Court to assist with the issue.
There's a legal case still continuing here with President Omar al-Bashir not being arrested. What now? Where does that leave the government?
Well, the minister announced on the 19th, I think it was 2 weeks ago actually, that they intend to withdraw from that case. But you cannot unilaterally withdraw from a case. According to the Constitutional Court rules, you have to ensure that there's agreement from all the parties, then write to the registrar of the court, and then if the Chief Justice so directs, the matter will be withdrawn. When that announcement was made, none of those procedures had been followed. And so we're in effect challenging this attempt to withdraw as well. And as far as we're concerned, the hearing will continue on the 22nd of November.
Now, your organization did not manage to persuade the South African government to really go ahead and arrest President al-Bashir when he was here. How do you foresee moving forward? What is your intentions?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say we didn't manage to persuade them. The High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal also ruled that South Africa should have arrested President Omar al-Bashir.
Yes.
So what we have here is a state disobeying its own courts, which is a different issue altogether. The obligation to arrest President Bashir, should he come to South Africa, still exists, even if South Africa withdraws from the Rome Statute, because your commitments and your obligations prior to your withdrawal from the Act remain in effect, especially in this case because the trial chamber from the ICC wrote to South Africa, actually in a judgment, indicating that they were duty-bound to arrest President Bashir. That duty will exist regardless.
Why do you want South Africa to stay with the ICC and not go its own way, perhaps?
So we have to think of international criminal justice holistically, which means justice at the domestic level, justice at the regional level, and justice at the international level. These 3 levels can function concurrently and in harmony. And that's what the state doesn't seem to understand. So we want South Africa to remain within the international system, to improve the system, to push for reform. You can only reform the ICC from within. And South Africa, given its stature, given its respect from its African peers, had the potential to reform the ICC from within and correct all those deficiencies that we're all aware of. But from now, if they leave the system, they can't change it. And then we have a deficiency at the international justice level. And we may potentially have a deficiency at the domestic justice level. And at the regional level, there is no regional court with criminal jurisdiction. So there's also a deficiency there. So all around, all we're seeing is deficiencies. And the government is proactively creating these gaps in justice.
We had the previous speaker, and we talked about the injustices faced by African countries, or perhaps the unnecessary focus on African countries for that matter. Is that a fair point, though?
It is a fair point. I think, as I said, the ICC is far from perfect. And for as long as items such as the United Nations Security Council referral exists, where you have 3 of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council vetoing referrals to the ICC. Those 3 members, by the way, Russia, China, the US, non-signatories. It's unfair that they get to dictate who ends up before the ICC and who doesn't, and that is something that seriously needs to be considered and looked at. But this general perception of bias, the ICC is targeting Africa, if you look at the facts, this is incorrect, because most of those cases are what we call self-referrals. Independent, autonomous African governments have referred themselves to the ICC.
Now, there are some other African countries that is following South Africa now. How will that impact on perhaps mass withdrawal from the ICC?
This is a serious concern. We've seen Burundi follow suit. Gambia has spoken about doing so. But first of all, we need to remember that every year, around about this time, states talk about withdrawal. Namibia did it last year, but never actually withdrew. Uganda has spoken about it. Kenya has spoken about it. But they all haven't withdrawn. But now that South Africa has set the wheels in motion, I think we are at risk of seeing many more states follow suit, which would be a travesty for international justice and mostly a travesty for the African victims of these crimes.
Thank you so much for your time and joining us here.
Thank you for having me.
That was the Southern Africa Litigation Centre criminal justice lawyer here in studio. Program manager, Angela Umtukuti, joining us in studio. That is our focus today on the ICC. You can also let us know what's on your mind on the Twitter handle as well as on the Facebook page around this issue. But let's go to Eben and Kendall for Focus.